that's enough of that. Welcome to the dungeon. Aliens, guys, Aliens 2022. Just felt like coming on, and is there a more interesting topic than is there other life in the universe? Oh, let me grab the link and drop that in the chat. Let me find out where I do that. Chat, comments, paste that in. Oops, I might have put a dash on the end. Let's try that again. Oh, welcome. We also welcome to just sit there and listen, whatever rocks your boat. Yeah, I remember back when I was a student, my university days, and I had this idea. Actually, I had the idea when I was a college student, which is kind of like, I think, equivalent to senior high school for those in the US. And it was an idea for a spaceship, an interplanetary propulsion system. Cirrus says Parley says the freak show, baby. Cirrus says, I hope there's life. It's too terrifying to think we're alone. Yeah, I don't know what's more terrifying. Possibly being alone. But it's terrifying to think, that given it's unlikely humans have reached peak evil, what other hells might exist out there, right? You ever thought about that? What is peak evil? So anyway, I had this idea, and basically it's how can I say it? Exploiting the process of nuclear fusion, but in space. You have what's called the solar wind, and that's a stream of charged particles that pour out of the sun primarily. And they're mostly protons. Proton is basically a neutron but has a positive charge. Very small, and they move pretty quickly, I think around 200 kilometers a second. And there's one about every cubic centimeter in space. So space is not really a perfect vacuum, especially when you're inside of a solar system with an active star. So the idea was you would have a huge superconducting ring generating a massive magnetic field that extended for hundreds and hundreds, possibly thousands of kilometers. And that would interact with charged particles, because charged particles follow a curved path in the magnetic field. Let me bring up some comments in the chat just while I'm speaking here. So the proposal was to essentially create an artificial Van Allen belt. We have magnetic field lines extending around the spacecraft, kind of like a giant bar magnet, if you know what the field lines look like. They kind of loop around, come out one end, loop around, and come in the other. And as the solar wind particles fly by, they hit the field lines, they go in a curve, and they basically spiral around the field lines, and they kind of get funneled into the core of the spacecraft, which would be where the reactor is. And so the cool thing about it is you don't actually have to carry any fuel, because the fuel is just flying around everywhere in the form of these high velocity protons. Now, the question is then, are they moving fast enough so that if you could collide them with each other, if you have some coming in one way, some coming in the other way, are they moving fast enough to actually initiate fusion? And this turns out to actually be a very complicated question, and not one that I was ever able to really work out. It's said that fusion occurs at 10 million degrees Celsius, which is pretty hot. Hotter than we can normally achieve. Although, note to self, remind me to come back to, in fact, I'll write it down, alternative fusion technologies, because that's an interesting topic too. So the question is, what is the temperature in space? It's complicated because the density of the particles is so low, but they're moving so fast. If you have a body of gas at a certain temperature, it turns out that one particle might be moving a lot faster than another particle. And there's just kind of this average velocity. But any one particle is probably not exactly average. And some are moving way faster than most of the others until they crash into something. And some are moving way slower. So the question is, what does 10 billion degrees really mean relative to particles which are moving about 200 kilometers per second? And there's some weird maths with Boltzmann distributions and shit like that, which I don't understand. From what I could gather, 200 kilometers per second would put you on the wrong side of that curve. You'd be on the slower side. Whereas when you have fusion at 10 million Celsius, probably it's only the fastest particles that are actually colliding and fusing together. And so you would have to accelerate those particles. And that's not so difficult, right? It's a charged particle, so all you need is an electric field. You could have a plate with a hole in it. The particle comes in through the hole. Apply a like charge to the plate, and then it accelerates. And so I think, between the ability to focus the particles and the ability to accelerate them, although you would need an energy source to do that, you probably could make this work. And you would have a way of generating energy and ultimately emitting gamma rays, which I think is what propels the thing forwards, because you have to conserve momentum, right? And you'd have a propulsion system. And I'm there as this naive, kind of enthusiastic physics student. And I'm telling my tutor, actually, a woman named Elizabeth, originally from Poland. Interesting looking woman. And she kind of got bothered. It was the most odd thing. Like, the idea really irritated her. And she started talking about how for years people had been trying to prove relativity wrong. And they'd always failed and always failed and always failed. I'm standing there like, just trying to be polite, but I'm thinking, what the fuck has this got to do with relativity? Right. I'm not proposing faster than light particle speeds or anything. Speed of light's 300,000 kilometers a second. So she gets really agitated and she starts dissing my idea. I'm like, okay, wasn't trying to offend you. I sort of, didn't bother sharing it anymore after that. But I found out many years later, that this exact same design was actually put forward by NASA in like 1966 by professional physicists, not naive kids, right? But they never built it. They've never actually tried to build that kind of system. The technology now would be a lot better because you have type 2 superconductors available and a much better understanding of how magnetic fields behave with those superconductors. And I don't know if you would really want a superconductor. You might just use a normal conductor. But anyway. So it's plausible, guys. Vindicated. I felt so vindicated after all those years when I found that out. So there you go. I'm just keeping the room warm, guys, if anyone wants to come in. This isn't going to be like a 6-hour stream. So if you want to jump on now. But yes, space, aliens, what do you think? I know that I've seen some things with my own two eyes which I can't explain. And I've shared these stories elsewhere, so I'll share them again. But I was on a boat. There's a yacht, 30-foot yacht here in the local port. A gentleman had purchased it. It didn't have an engine. And so this isn't meant to be a boat story, but kind of is. Anyway, he wanted me to jump on board and just lend a hand while he tested it out without a fucking engine. And I'm like, okay, don't go over there because it's shallow. And so he wouldn't listen and go over there. So we run aground on a mud flat, like 100 yards from the dock. And the fucking tide's going out. And so I got stuck there. And anyway, it was arranged that I would come back at night when the tide was coming in. And I did that, and I saw a strange fireball shoot through the sky towards the west. And anyway, the boat came loose on its own, and I sort of went home. And the next day, I meet him again at about 10 a.m. I'm looking up at this sky for some reason. It's a really crisp, clear day, sort of in the country area, very clean air, excellent visibility. And, I think I have not bad eyesight. And there's this aircraft, and it's very high altitude. I used to be a paraglider pilot, so I can judge altitude a little better than most people. But this thing is like at least commercial jet level, but probably a lot higher. And what's unusual about it is that, one, it had a weird shape, and two, it would rotate. It was kind of shaped like the space shuttle, but this was after the space shuttle had been decommissioned due to the accidents that they had. And this thing was flying probably 5 or 10 times faster than like a 747. No contrail or anything. And it would tumble. It would like barrel roll, and it would get all erratic without changing course. It's very strange. It's very white. And it was so high that, when it disappeared, it didn't go over the horizon. It just sort of evaporated from sight eventually. We're just talking space and aliens and UFOs, Mathis. And so I'm looking at this thing, wondering what it is. And, I never knew. But years later, some video came out from, I think it was the US military. And they had these sort of semi-triangular blobs that they filmed from like an F-15 or something, some kind of aircraft. And they were actually tracking it, I think, on infrared camera. And they would do these weird sort of rotations. And this was leaked onto YouTube like a couple of years ago. And so that's basically what I saw. So whatever it is, didn't seem to be behaving in a way that conventional aircraft are capable of. The pilots who were tracking it also observed it changing direction very rapidly, which, was breaking the normal laws of inertia. The UFO that dropped off Marcelo, I don't know about that one. Someone will have to share that story with me. So yeah, that's a UFO story. I actually wrote down a report, being a scientist, like the day after, just so I had it all recorded for posterity. It's on an old computer lying around here somewhere. But yeah, aliens. I'm not saying it's alien, but I mean, it is one explanation. A lot of people believe in God, which is kind of crazier than believing in aliens, right? I think it is. But yeah, aliens, guys. Who believes in them? Who doesn't? And then there's different types of aliens, right? I remember I read this book. I think it was by Hal Clement. Mission of Gravity, I think it's called. Very early. I shouldn't say very. I'm going to say it might have come out in the 50s. And it kind of blew my mind a bit because the aliens were like little caterpillars. They weren't little green men. And they were on a planet with really high gravity. So that's called Mission of Gravity. and there's a human being studying them. And he sort of has to live in like a pool of water because he can't really support his own body weight very well because of the crushing, pressures. So he sort of sits around in a pool of water most of the time. And these little caterpillars are like really scared of heights because under those gravitational conditions, if you fall like 1 foot, you're dead. And so, it was kind of an ingenious creation of, a theoretical world on a high gravity planet, I thought. We have adapted for our conditions here on Earth, but there's no reason why, a really high mass planet might not exist in the so-called habitation zone, right, where you have liquid water. And then, the form factor of the beings on that planet would probably differ compared to what we have here. You're not going to have like human-like creatures walking around on spindly 2 legs, right? They're going to be like, little cockroaches and things. So yeah, aliens. I used to be a little preoccupied with them, and one day I was camping. I went fishing up at the lakes. Great Lake, it's called. Great Lake used to be. There's always a lake there. A lot of lakes here were created by installing dams, but this was a natural one, albeit slightly enlarged today. Very barren place, very barren, very vast rocky shores. It's a slow fill lake. It takes 7 years or so for it to fill up if they drain it too low via the hydroelectric dam. Anyway, I'm up there, and I had a 1978 Toyota Corona, very light green, pale green, chrome bumper bars, chrome headlight, surrounds. Had 2 headlights on each side, chrome roof racks. Beautiful car. Anyway, it was a wagon, so I thought, I couldn't be bothered pitching a tent. It's like, why bother? So I just slept in the back of the fucking car. And for some reason, I think because of something that happened earlier in the day, I was, you're there camping on your own. Your mind drifts to strange places, right? But I think I was, pondering alien life and shit like that. And suddenly there's like, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. I'm down this lonely road. There's no one else around. No one really camps here. And I hear this pounding, like really violent pounding on the roof of the car. Just as I'm thinking about aliens and alien abduction and shit. And I was terrified. I just sat bolt upright. It's like, 3 a.m. or something. You know what it was? It wasn't an alien come down to take me away. I had a horse blanket on the bonnet of the car to stop the water freezing in the radiator. And I'd put these big rocks, like head-sized rocks, all over it. And the wind got up under the fucking rug and the rocks had tumbled across the bonnet, which is the hood of the car. Scared the living shit out of me, that did. Way too deep conversation for 8 a.m. on a Sunday. Yeah. Where is everyone? I'm in Australia. It's 1 a.m. here. Perfect time for creepy stories. 1 a.m. But they say statistically there are just like Sirius's comment, there are just billions and billions of planets that are suitable for habitation. If you assume carbon-based life and DNA-based life, kind of like what we have here on Earth. But some people have conjectured about silicon-based life, and I kind of just took that as an interesting point without ever really thinking about it at a chemistry level, even though that's what I am, a chemist. And I had a laugh when someone pointed out online somewhere that if carbon-based life results in exhaling CO2, which is what happens, right? If you had a silicon-based life form, you might have to somehow exhale, so to speak, SiO2, also known as quartz or silica, right? That would be a problem, wouldn't it? Can you imagine if you had to breathe out fucking rock? Silicon bonds are kind of longer and weaker than carbon bonds, so I'm actually pretty fucking doubtful about silicon-based life. It's solely based on the ability of silicon to bind to 4 other things. This is the advantage of carbon as well. It can bind to 4 other atoms, and so you can build up these branched structures, and it's almost infinitely complicated what you can create with, branching systems. So I'm not really, I'm highly skeptical that silicon-based life is out. It's an interesting plot for a science fiction book or film, but once you learn a little bit about silicon chemistry, it's kind of unlikely. It is interesting that Wendy's and McDonald's and those places, they actually put silicon oil in the fucking chips, or the fries, whatever the fuck you call them over there. They take silicon oil, which we normally use in chemistry labs for like really high temperature work, where you can't use a water bath because it boils, and most oil breaks down if you heat it too hot. So you have these synthetic half carbon, half silicon oils, and they're amazing. And Wendy's puts them in the fucking deep fryer because it stops the oil from frothing. And I remember when I learned that, I just couldn't bear the thought of eating fries from any of those places, because it's not a natural product. It's like a mineral-based product. And okay, I guess in theory fuck, people get silicon implants, right? It's the same kind of shit. But, do you really want that lining your intestinal tract? I don't know, man. If I was a silicon-based alien, I'd probably be okay with it, but the burnt taste, yeah, no, it's just for the frothing, apparently. But talk about gross. I'm gonna drop the link if anyone wants to come on. I'm not gonna stream forever, but anyone wants to come on. Yeah, space and aliens. You think statistically it has to happen. Scientists have created these closed, God, I should know the name because it's a famous experiment, closed systems where they start off sterile. It was meant to recreate, I think, the Earth's early atmosphere, right? And so they'd put some water in there, some carbon dioxide, some of the elements that we have, naturally present. And then the key is they would stimulate it using electrical discharges, which is meant to represent lightning in the atmosphere. You guys might have heard about this experiment. And so they're zapping away, and it turns out that when you do that, because they had nitrogen in there and, there's hydrogen in the water, and it turns out you start creating amino acids. Amino acids, if you hear the word amine, something, that means it's nitrogen based in chemistry. So amino acids have nitrogen in them, and they're the building blocks for life. And so you chain up a bunch of amino acids, you form, not a biochemist, but I think you get a protein at that point. And ultimately you can end up with RNA or DNA. And so they could create these biological building blocks. Oh, Aussie's here. Artificially. Let me add Aussie. Hey man, how you going?
Hey Cuddy, nice to meet you. I don't believe we've ever streamed together, but enjoying your chemistry content so far.
You know, what else do you do at 1 a.m. on a rainy night? I mean, what do you want to say about aliens? You are a believer?
I'm a big Carl Sagan fan, so I think he
Okay.
referenced some of that experiment that you're talking about. And
Oh, okay.
was it C. Clarke or something like that said there's either two options. There's no other species in the universe, or it's full of them, and both are scary.
Both are scary. That's
Yeah.
right. You know, they say to believe is, oh, I forget where I heard this definition, but and it's not a commonly repeated definition, but it's one that I tend to adhere to. The definition of belief is to be committed to the notion.
Mhm.
So that's kind of a high bar to be committed to something. I generally believe the only certainty is uncertainty. I think Christopher Hitchens was the first one I heard say that. So yeah, it's hard to say that I believe there are aliens, but I think it's far more likely that there are.
Yeah, I mean, even just within our own galaxy, it seems highly likely, in my opinion. And then you factor in that there's there's a lot of galaxies, and
Hell
that's
of a lot
really
of
an understatement.
galaxies.
That like there's nothing that we would describe as a lot compared to the numbers we're talking about in terms of stars and galaxies.
Did you know that with the Voyager spacecraft, they put a gold disc on there to tell anyone who found it all about the human race?
Hmm. Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, I feel like maybe one day we're going to have a mission to go get that back before the wrong people find it. You
Like
know what I
the
mean?
Star Trek movie. I think it was the first movie.
Oh, did they do that? Did they beat
Yeah,
me to it? Shit.
yeah. Voyager
Oh,
comes
that's
back. That's a
yeah.
spoiler, but anyway, you've had a lot of
I know.
time.
I know that Carl Sagan, not Carl Sagan, Stephen Hawking said that we should probably err on the side of not giving away our location and so on. You know, because like
Right.
people like beaming out radio signals, trying to contact anyone who might be listening and say, "Hey, come over for a visit."
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I'm a Star Trek fan, and in Star Trek, like the rule is not until that race has gained their own faster than light capability are we going to come in contact. But that's the ethical way. The reverse side of that is like maybe we should be trying to contact aliens until we've got our own faster than light program as well.
Yeah, that's true.
We don't need to be ants.
Do you think faster than light travel is possible?
Um, I ultimately I think not. I know physics pretty damn well, and the type of technology you would have to build is just like I don't think
No.
our civilization will survive to see that level of technology being made. It's just not because we're talking about like really pushing the limits of physics, which means like having vehicles that can survive things that are very similar to black holes. Like
Yeah.
that just doesn't exist, right? So it's just
You almost
yeah.
have to, be disincarnate somehow to talk about shit like that, right?
Yeah, there's also a lot of other problems with like the idea of fast and light travel. I mean, yeah, we don't need to get too deep. There's a really great channel, PBS Space Time, or also hosted by an Australian. It's just
Oh,
phenomenal, and yeah, it's really that channel that really got me relatively well versed on actual space time as opposed to I don't know. There's a lot of documentaries and stuff you can watch about the cosmos
you got to be
with Stephen
careful
Hawking
about.
and all that kind of stuff.
I know, from my own branch of science, like you have to be careful about dumbed down explanations because a lot of it's education by analogy, and you can kind
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
push the analogies too far.
Yeah, yeah. There was a recent video by Veritasium who challenged the idea that electricity flows through wires. It was really, really interesting. I've always kind of understood it to be the case, but I didn't know the exact deals. And I'm from an electrical engineering background, so I know a little bit more about the equations, but
Right.
maybe not so much physics. I mean, this isn't an engineering courses where we actually do quantum physics,
Right.
but I forgot the name of the really great quantum physics guy. But in general, in the engineering landscape, the quantum physics we do typically is of the line of shut up and calculate. So it's really just about like do the math, use the math, but don't really question what's actually happening too much.
Okay. Was
Because the
I?
math works. So
Yeah.
and you couldn't actually have real world like fiber optics and communication. None of that would work if quantum physics wasn't actually real and we didn't have models that spoke of
I
it.
see.
But yeah, but the best
Hey,
math comes from ideas of like the multiverse and so forth. So um, yeah.
there's this guy on a documentary I saw years ago. I think he was an American physicist, and he had this apparatus that looked like kind of like an old school, reel-to-reel tape player or something. And he was trying to prove that he could share information faster than light, because you're not meant to be able to do that.
No, absolutely not.
And anyway, his proof though was kind of interesting. And what he did was he played a sound recording of a famous piece of music,
Mhm.
and he could prove, according to him, he could prove it got there faster than the speed of light. But the trade-off was it was like all scratchy and distorted, so there was information
I,
lost.
I'm not. I'm really. I'd have to really see a lot more than that because the real limit of light isn't that light is limited. It's causality is limited. So that's probably an easier way to think of it, is that light
Right.
isn't just limited, and there might be ways to get around it. The universe just has a limit of the speed of causality, as in
Is
it doesn't matter if you describe light or any other function, that the speed of causality is that speed that we know as the speed of light, not
I've
just
never really studied quantum physics, but sometimes on like with some of the layman stuff that I've read, I was kind of inclined to wonder if a lot of this actually depends on the presence of an observer.
that was really like the early days of quantum physics, like first maybe 10 or 20 years. And these days, as I said, 98% of like people who actually use quantum physics as part of their job um, are just in the field of shut up and calculate. So they don't question why it works. So the why aspect comes into play because there is observer effects come into play. But
Right.
but it's not deterministic, as in it's like, but if I didn't observe it, would it have just continued being in the superposition, like
That's
where
what I've wondered. Like, if you take away the observer, does some of what we think about uncertainties in causation actually go away?
yeah. So, but the most, how do you say, outside of the people who are shut up and calculate, um, there's 2% where people are actually still trying to figure out fundamental questions, which is like, is it still in a superposition or something like that? The most popular out of that 2%, or maybe even less, the most popular explanation is that of the multiverse, and
Right.
that just means that every outcome. So you say like Schrodinger's cat type thing. The cat is either dead or it's alive.
I was going to ask you to explain that, but I'll let you finish this thought first.
Yeah, either the cat is either dead or alive, and then when you open the box, you will collapse the superposition, and then it will only be one outcome. The cat will either be dead or alive. But in the intermediate time, it's like woo, limbo or something.
Right.
The most popular current way of thinking about that is that we have a multiverse, and that is every possible outcome always occurs, that there is a universe where that cat died after the first decay of that stuff that was in there, the thing, it killed the cat. And then there's also a universe where it didn't decay and the cat's still alive, and both are true.
Let me
It's
just catch up with chat.
Yeah.
Where's Diego's comment? An obvious issue with travel at or beyond the speed of light is debris objects in space. That's true. We haven't mapped every penny-sized rock floating around beyond. Yep. I mean, if you're on like a several light years journey, I guess the odds are you might crash into something. We're the aliens, says Sleeping Legend. Diego, any kind of radar system which could map out what's ahead of you would be moot if you're traveling at the speed of light, pretty much. You'd be traveling at the same speed as the radar. Does that make sense?
There's a lot more problems with traveling near the speed of light than just radar.
Crashing into shit.
Yeah, there's a lot more problems with that. Like, if you had any serious amount of mass traveling extremely close to the speed of light, that object would effectively,
consume the energy of the universe.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems with getting close to actual speed. So when anyone talks about faster than light travel, they can't be talking about building up kinetic energy.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just not.
Actually, I've heard an alternative view that when you are pushing beyond yet relativistic speeds, that it's interpreted as the kinetic energy increasing, even though the velocity is barely increasing.
Mm-hmm.
But the alternative view is that the mass of the object is actually increasing.
Yeah,
which I thought was an interesting way of looking at it. But with the multiverse system, like the reason I kind of doubt that, I don't want to go into like religious views necessarily, but it means you have worlds out there where like really terrible things happen, like one after the like people getting tortured for the rest of their life and shit, right?
So one of the things that I think is misunderstood about the multiverse is is that it's easy to imply that everything happens, but the reality is that only the things that are potentially in a superposition that decay out of that superposition, and then the world veers one way, left or right. And we're talking about just normal everyday physics. So inside your body you have radioactive isotopes that will decay. We consider those superpositions, and those will decay and emit another particle or radiation at that point. But the reality is that the decay of any particular substance in your body usually doesn't result in like a macro behavior change from you, right? Like this is happening like hundreds of times per second, but it's it's just absorbed, and it's just another like one cell in your body got a little bit more energy, and it's possible that maybe one triggers cancer or something like that eventually over the course of your lifetime. But we're not talking about I wonder if I stayed with that girl in high school. That's probably not going to be one of the worlds, because your decision about whether or not you stayed with that girl in high school was probably a lot less influenced by the random decay of a single isotope or something like that, or a cosmic particle hitting one of your neurons.
What's your definition of superposition?
That's a good question, because to me it used to be things like photons, like and their path of travel, and you'd have to observe a photon. But there's a lot of experiments now, a lot of science trying to build quantum computers, which rely on being able to maintain something in a superposition. And so they're doing it with like single atoms and stuff like that. So it's I don't know. I don't know anymore, to be honest. What would be defined as a superposition? Yeah, it's
Yeah,
easy to say just photons. Like just like does it go through slot A or slot B,
well, you have
and where it
the
lands?
famous
But
was it Mulligan's double slit experiment where it had to be in both slots at the same time, even though it was a fucking particle.
yes,
So
exactly.
that's kind of weird shit, right?
Yeah. Now that's
Um,
the easiest to experiment with and observe, but they're building quantum computers out of atom-sized elements. You know, like I
yeah,
mean, they're
I had
building in.
colleagues that work on that.
Yeah, so they're creating superpositions with entire atoms, not just subatomic particles or photons. So I don't know. I'm willing to say I don't know.
You know, there's rumors that, not rumors, they actually claimed some company claims they actually have a quantum computer fully operational. People who know about it say, it's kind of a quasi quantum computer, but not really.
Mhm.
But yeah, I don't know. Bill West, I
I'm
think the
very
pyramids were
skeptical
built
of a
by
lot of
aliens.
quantum computer claims. Like the problem is there's been so many companies and stuff claiming that they've reached what's called quantum supremacy. Like that's the point at which a quantum computer is able to exceed the power of a conventional computer for a given task. And I know Google launched a paper like like a few years ago, saying they had quantum supremacy, and then since then nothing of it. Like they haven't been able to no one's been able to repro their stuff, and it's just bullshit basically. But
Do you reckon they just got told, this is something we probably shouldn't brag about?
no, I think there's just so much money waiting to be invested in such a thing that if you say you have quantum supremacy, you're going to be made a millionaire,
Right.
regardless of whether or not you have it.
Let's just read some chat comments. Another theory is there are infinite Earths within our own universe. If you believe our universe is built with a finite number of building blocks, and that universe is continued.
I'm not sure
Infinite.
that there are like that's not. I'm not sure that's founded on like what you're talking there, Diego, is like really talking about like infinite number of universes. Now, whether or not many worlds supports infinite number of worlds versus some set, there won't be a world where someone is literally like Superman. That isn't like that isn't the outcome of a certain special set of decays of radiation. You know what I mean? Like it's like there's no world that exists, even though you may have been split into billions and billions of worlds, billions of billions of divergent cases involving superpositions. There's no world in which you are Superman.
Here's a thought. You know how like most quantities in physics are quantized, right? Like you have the Planck
Yes.
duration and shit like that. If you have like a greater and greater and greater number of universes, any one universe, like the bigger that total is, any one universe becomes a smaller and smaller fraction of total reality. And eventually, if there's some quantum number of possible realities or fraction, you would eventually go below that fraction, which shouldn't be possible. Right?
That's a good point. Like so, most describe the many worlds theory as like dividing the total amount of energy each time you split the world, and if energy was quantized in any way for that purpose, then I don't know what would happen, to be honest.
What's the theory called? What's that called?
So that's just how many. So that would just be sort of like a frequently asked question in many worlds. So if energy is conserved and one world becomes two, how do we have? How's that even possible? Did we double the energy or did we halve it?
I think now you start talking about the two universes not even being related anymore, right?
Well, that's the description of world. So if it's a separate world, there's no way that the other world will ever be able to interact with the other one ever again.
Right.
Otherwise, it would be like many, I don't know,
Many-
planes of existence or something. But it by world they mean, and it's not different universe. So like it's described as world, and in generally different worlds cannot interact with each other. Otherwise, they would cease to be
Right.
different worlds.
Well, we do have all this dark energy that's doing something, so maybe that's what it's doing. Get heads a million times in a row will take a long time and is very improbable, but finite building blocks, heads, tails, infinite time, it will happen.
I
Do you
agree
think
with
it will
that,
happen
but
or not?
no, I agree with that statement. So heads and tails are actual real world outcomes, right? They're um, supported by our everyday observation. I think what Diego's trying to point out is that a lot of things can happen as soon as you start talking about a lot of different worlds. However, the problem with the heads or tails thing is like I don't think you will get a million chances to actually perform that function, because you'll be dead before the end of it, and there probably isn't a world where every heads or tails is influenced by a superposition. So there won't be, because if the choice of heads or tails was a clear outcome of a superposition collapsing, then yes, there will eventually, every time you roll that quantum coin,
Yep.
there will be a particular universe that actually goes all the way heads a million times in the row.
Is it dangerous to assume that, you can just extrapolate the theory of because it is probability is a theory at the end of the day. Is it dangerous to assume that you can extrapolate it, to the nth degree in either direction?
Well, in the physics world, probability doesn't exist.
Okay.
So there's no outcome that can't be known. There's a really cool TV show called Devs that dealt with like quantum computers and determinism and stuff like that. And what's really interesting is like our mind doesn't have like quantum stuff in it. Like our decisions aren't the outcomes of quantum superposition switching. It's what's going on in our heads is just straight physics, which is always deterministic. Once you get to quantum physics, we start dealing with probability tables, but that's only because we will only experience one of the many worlds. And so what the probability table is telling us is it's telling us what is our likelihood of, at the outcome of this experiment, which world we will find ourselves in. But what is deterministic about it is that every outcome will actually occur. Do you get what I mean?
I kind of get it, but at the same time, I can't help but feel this is just an abstraction.
That's fair. That's fair.
I guess.
Hey, Diego.
Hey, Diego.
Figured it'd just be easier to explain it than try to type it.
Yes, welcome.
So the theory is that within our own universe, there are many, many, many Earths very similar to ours, and some would say an infinite, and not just the Earth, but the Milky Way galaxy, our solar system, etc. But there are an infinite number more that are similar but different in a few things. Like you were saying, the cat is dead or alive in the box. And the way that they explain it is you have to have you have to believe three things. One, that within our entire universe, that is ever expanding, that first of all, it is infinite and it's continuously growing. The second truth you have to believe is that within this entire universe, all the elements are there. So like heads and tails would be the elements, and that we're all made of atoms, and you, I, and everything in this world is nothing more than an arrangement of atoms, i.e., the heads and tails, the combination of the outcomes. So the outcomes being the different elements and all that. So they say if you go far enough, just as if you flip a coin enough times, eventually the very, very improbable will happen. So you'll flip the coin heads a million times in a row. It's going to take a long time. So just as if you go out into our own universe a long, long, long way, eventually you will find the same arrangement of atoms. And you will also find the same arrangement of atoms where something's very slightly different. Like your name is, I don't know, Swiss expat, or I'm not wearing a blue shirt, I'm wearing a red shirt. You know what I mean? So that's one of the theories. I know you're talking about multiverse, but there's also that theory that within our own universe, there are like.
Are you assuming
who espouses that theory though? So I'm just.
I don't even remember, but again, you have to believe those truths, right?
But that depends on an infinite life of the universe, right? Or closely.
Yeah, absolutely. But just like we all agree that if you flip a coin enough times, you'll get a million heads in a row. Then, if you believe that we are all made of a specific arrangement of atoms, then it's kind of you can't believe one and not the other.
Is it fair to say
though, like that... there's no, like as I said, from I question if this is actually espoused by anything in physics. Like the reason the multiverse is like proposed is because it makes the Schrodinger's equation, which is from our perspective purely probabilistic, like where you will see the photon on an AB slot experiment or something like that. So it's probabilistic, but it's a way of arriving at a world that is deterministic again. And Al makes the point, like quantum computer doesn't prove that there is a multiverse, only that the theory works for practical application, and that's absolutely correct. Like the Schrodinger's equation works. The only thing that's really troublesome about it is whether or not it's sort of like, how is that deterministic? If I don't use it, it's the observer problem where you say, oh, okay, but how about I don't observe it? Will it change the outcome? You know, is it dead or not dead? Because clearly time's passed. But the multiverse is just the simplest explanation for what we observe in reality, and that is the Schrodinger's equation explains everything, and we don't have to worry about the observer effect because there is no observer effect. What happens in reality from the multiverse theory is that all outcomes actually did occur. You just happen to find yourself in the one where the thing that you experience is what you experienced. But the other thing is also true.
And the example I propose, not necessarily like there's no equation to prove it. It's just a simple, again, if you flip the coin, I mean, you can do this yourself. You can flip a coin and you'll get heads 100 times in a row. It's going to take you probably a month, maybe a year, but if that's possible, then, and if you believe that we are simply an arrangement of atoms, i.e. like if you were to, I don't know, play Minecraft and you build different things in there, then, if you go far enough and you travel long enough and it's the same atoms over there as there are here, that they'll find themselves in the same arrangement. It's just a theory and an idea. I don't know if there's
infinity is a really big number ultimately. So if there are actually infinite worlds, then that means, as an example, while there could be a world that if they're literally infinite, there will be a world that contains something unbelievably improbable, right? So that's I think the way of sort of illustrating infinity is really big, but as soon as you go to infinity, it allows everything that is remotely like completely improbable will happen. It's guaranteed as soon as you go to level infinity. But really,
like if you're talking about like human beings made of gold, like no. Like that's the kind of stuff I'm or like
but I mean if there truly are infinite worlds, like
well, let's just
and the source of that infinity is not quantum decay, I don't know.
Let's assume our laws of physics don't change either, though, right? Like you were saying, Superman earlier. Like, no.
Yeah, but that actually that's not something that physicists take for granted. Actually, that the numbers that we find. So there's a lot of constant numbers within physics equations, and there's nothing really fundamental about why they should be that number. So there may be as you point out, like infinite number of universes that have. So that okay. So I think I know where that particular thing comes from, the infinite universes thing. That doesn't come from the quantum understanding of like Schrodinger's equation being deterministic, but through many worlds. That comes from more baseline physics. So, for example, why is the gravity coefficient the number that it is in our universe, and why is it so useful? Like if we do simulations and change that number just a little bit up, a little bit down, and the universe just friggin' splits apart and no planets are created, no stars are created, gas doesn't accumulate, and you either result in crunches or friggin' just uncontrolled dispersal. And so just that gravity coefficient is one that is highly, highly tuned. And there are other coefficients in physics where if we tune them in one way or the other, the universe will never, as we know it, would not even come close to existing.
They had to do that to get the expanding universe theory. There's a fudge factor for that.
So to arrive at a position where we have such a highly tuned universe with numbers that are just perfect for the creation of planets and stars and life, one theory is that, well, either we are unbelievably lucky that we ended up with those numbers, or there were an infinite number of universes and most of them simply died.
Right. Yep.
So whether or not that could result in gold humans or not is a little bit funky. But the problem is infinity is very, very big.
As soon as humans are gold, what are the Rolexes made of?
We probably wouldn't want gold; it'd just blend with us. But the problem with infinity, and I'm not saying it's the reason why not, but the real realization is like, how big is that number? If there's a world where we exist, so we do, well, let's just say that's a given, and the only reason we came about is because there was an infinite number of worlds that try out different numbers, and our set of numbers happened to be good and worked out like us. Well, infinity's really big, and that means there would also be an infinite number of universes with exactly the same as us.
Yeah, that's
literally
part of that
infinite.
theory.
Yeah, literally infinite.
That's part of the theory, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I get it. That one isn't as related to quantum physics though. It sounds similar, like many worlds versus infinite worlds, but they're explaining slightly different things. One's explaining sort of the fine tuning of our world's numbers, and the other is explaining the observer effect. Basically, one's eliminating the observer effect, that like your observations of the real world don't affect the real world. It's not, hocus pocus. The world is deterministic. I linked a book, although I'm not too sure if I'm allowed to post links here, so I think it might not have come up. But there's a really great author, Sean Carroll, and he is hardcore physics guy. It's not hocus pocus. And he does a really, really excellent job of explaining quantum physics and its implications. And by implications, I don't mean like this is how you change your life or something like that. This is not hocus pocus. It really is. He's really just like the Carl Sagan of quantum physics, basically.
You know how you said that the chemical processes happening in the brain are not, what was the term, superpositions? Does that mean that superpositions?
Yeah. So the results of your decision making are not the direct outcome of like an isotope in your head, like going one way or the other.
So, and I think you said, that means it's deterministic. Now, does that mean, since our brains are what we use to make decisions, does that mean that we don't have free will?
100%. That's gonna like freak out a lot of people, and there'll be a lot of very, very, like, that's the one that immediately it's like oh shit, my consciousness doesn't matter. So the
Can I call you as a witness at my upcoming trial?
So the problem there, to imply anything about free will, is like you would first have to actually describe it. So is free will the ability to do something that cannot be predicted? As in, if we had a way of understanding the current state of every neuron in your head and the environment in the world, you could what's it called? It's Laplace's demon. So Laplace's demon is an old school theory of, like, if you were able to know the position and state of every particle in the universe and throw it into a computer, you could simulate forward the universe in that computer, and it would be accurate. That such a thing could exist. Now, of course, it's very hard to know the current state of everything in the universe, but the idea is sound, that it is everything in the universe just billiard balls, and the outcomes are knowable. You know?
How can you have more quantum states in a computer if the computer's smaller?
No, you couldn't. It's like
It's
you would need
experiment.
more particles in the universe. You know, it's just a thought experiment. As in, is reality just a simulation? Can you know what we will look like t plus, real time plus 1 second from now? Could you know that? If you knew everything about current time, could you know how everything would end up 1 second from now? And then you go like way beyond that to like 1 million years, 10 million years, or I don't think you could rewind the clock in such a computer, but because there are certain ways that things decay that are not knowable in reverse. But anyway,
I think with the question of free will, and constructing theories based off experimentally derived physics, you risk drawing incorrect conclusions because you're not incorporating consciousness, which we don't really have a working theory.
Well, we don't have a working description of what consciousness is like, right? So the really good author on this one is Sam Harris, and I really love his book on meditation. And consciousness is really, really evades description. And even in your own head, as soon as you start looking for it, like internally looking for like consciousness, it disappears. Like if you meditate and practice even relatively basic meditation techniques, and I don't just mean listening to whale sounds, I mean like getting to the point where you are no longer experiencing thoughts, where you blank things out and that sort of thing. It is very easy to experience sort of the lapse in consciousness. That consciousness is so hard to pin down that it disappears as soon as you try look for it. And any external observation of what would be consciousness versus not conscious is also completely fails every single time. So it sounds like a quote unquote holy grail of something, but the reality is like we don't even have a really good description of it. And I don't mean we can't find it or there's something supernatural about it. It's just that consciousness seems to be something very special to us.
Did Rene Descartes ever give a definition? Because he was the guy who said, "I think, therefore I am," right? So he was pondering this stuff.
I think that's more about sort of existentialism, as in like, do I exist?
No, it is. It is.
Not so much.
What is it?
Yeah. Like, is there a scientific basis for consciousness? Like, there's like, here's the question: which part of the brain allows you to be conscious, and can we simulate that, or something like that? The reality is like the starting statement is really a non-starter, because we can't even define what consciousness is. Because, as I said,
I think
I
I've
don't think
heard.
any real physicist believes that we have free will. So
I seem to recall a statement from someone saying consciousness is the ability to reason.
no, like that's even more predictable than not, right?
How do you mean?
So perhaps more interesting is your original question about do we have free will, and the idea of Laplace's daemon and stuff like that, and like what would we decide free will looks like even? So if you were completely predictable, that sounds like a completely how do you say deterministic universe, which doesn't sound like free will if you were able to be predicted every time. Is that fair to say?
If we weren't able to be predicted, you're saying that's deterministic?
No. If your decision making was always predictable, that would be deterministic.
Right. Yep.
And
at least it would
like,
appear to be.
Yeah. So increasing your decision making to be more and more reasonable makes it so deterministic that even we don't even need Laplace's daemon to figure out what you're going to do.
So increasing your decision making makes it more and more reasonable. Therefore,
No. So if your decision making is more reasonable, we're talking about having like structures to your decision making, like Pareto efficiency, not hurting people, moral outcomes, stuff like that. So if you make it more and more reasonable, so the outcome of your decision making is very reasonable, you don't even need Laplace's daemon to figure out what you're going to do.
Right. This becomes easier and easier to know.
Yeah. So the reality is that you have to steer towards less predictability, to the extent that even Laplace's daemon will not predict your decisions.
And that means you're steering away from reasonability.
Yes.
So you're saying it's the opposite of what the definition I gave you is.
Yes. So the only way you could like steer it away from saying being determined by Laplace's daemon is that even after you know everything, every atom in your head and its current state, that the next second it just like the decision outcome just sort of like pops into existence from literally nowhere, and then it goes one way next, and this person would be just wild. You couldn't like, they do not adhere to reason. They don't even understand their own decision making, because that's like a macro level decision. They didn't do that at a macro level that you would call that reasonability. So there'd be no distinction between a person who had quote unquote that level of free will and just utter craziness, right?
That's scary. I feel like this is a bit of a paradox. I suspect there's a resolution to it, but I'm not quite sure what it is. But I'm sure greater minds have failed to find one.
Well, I think it's easier just to arrive at the outcome that the world is deterministic. And from that TV show Devs, I said, it's like, are we wizards or not? As in, do we defy the laws of the universe in our heads, just in our heads? I think it's relatively easy to say that we probably aren't wizards.
It would be, I feel like the problem would be easier if we were disincarnate and there were no issues with, gravity and interaction of particles and conserving momentum and shit like that.
Right. That's a good point. You frame it quite well. Like, if we had decisions that literally popped into the universe out from not from the current internal state, but just like popped into existence, we would have really weirdly observable physics breaking stuff going inside of our brains.
Right.
If that was the case.
G'day to all the people who just dropped in. Mushrooms have all the answers.
Yeah. I encourage people to look at Laplace's daemon. What was it? Proposed in 1814.
Do you think like aliens, if they were super advanced, they would approach problems of their own existence in terms of mobility and gathering information and causation in some way that's completely, beyond our comprehension? Like, would they be in like a different paradigm, do you think? Or are we kind of all restricted to like three-dimensional thought?
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Like, I think there's a good YouTube, PBS Space Time, and maybe if you just looked it up, there's a similar question called "Is math real?" and or is
I've
physics
wondered
real?
that.
so a lot of the world makes sense to us with numbers, right? Like we model so much of our world of numbers, and we can do useful things for our lives with numbers. Like I've got one tripod here, another tripod there. I bring the same room. I've got two tripods. This extends to things like I can measure the speed of my car and so on and so forth. But a lot of that is actually underpinned by relatively fundamental philosophical problems. Like I think Plato really studied the idea of the atomic, and like this is like ancient Greek stuff, but his justification for us calling this complex series of parts and atoms, that at the most rooted level, at this most fundamental level, like the atomic level, that there is something tripody about it. So even our ability to say that this is one tripod from a non-human perspective, or even someone who has a mental disorder, like maybe they're on acid or something, the whole idea that this is literally an integer, literally one, as opposed to infinity, infinite configuration of atoms. To us, that's just one tripod, but that's a complete oversimplification of the real world, right?
Yeah. Actually,
so
just
our numbers
me.
only work as soon as we start applying human things to it. Like that thing over there is a bench, but does anything else in the world see that as a bench?
Can you have numbers without particles?
Right. But we never started counting particles, right? Like when we created all of math, like almost all of it was created well before our understanding what the most fundamental particles were.
Actually, just on that point, the ancient Greeks were split between the atomists. I'm just inventing that term, but these were guys who thought that everything was made of atoms, and the other guys who thought everything was made of earth, air, fire, and water, and ether, I think. But a lot of people know that from high school. But what I learned recently was that the atomists actually thought that acids, the atoms in acids were triangular, and that's why it felt sharp on your skin. Which, it's kind of funny. I mean, I can see what.
But I mean, was that a predictive outcome though? As in, maybe that was useful enough for them. Maybe they went one step too far, where they hypothesized about why it felt sharp on the skin because they were triangular. But maybe that's a useful outcome, because they say, oh, but bases are sort of like square shaped, and when you put them together, you end up in configurations that are stable, which is kind of what we see with pH, right? You put an acid and a base together, they arrive at a.
I mean, ultimately, even the shape of atoms right up through the 20th century was a useful abstraction that was ultimately not quite right. When you look at the shape of orbitals, they're not round. Or they can be,
right.
But they're often very, you would know, donut shaped and things like that.
Sorry, I got to do something real quick. I'll be back in 2 minutes.
Yep. I'll just go through chat. Can you please do your London accent for me, please? Okay. Is that London? There you go. No, I can't do French. Plato is my favorite philosopher. You can shape and mold it. Damn straight. I can't do Italian. Not good with the continent. Atom was theorized long before the microscope was developed. Yep. And the microscope apparently took a fair while after the telescope was invented. Do you know that? Didn't know Ozzy was into this stuff. No, I didn't know either. This is the physics class. Yep. How are you doing today? I'm all right. Thank you for asking.
Sorry about that. Just had to do the laundry. My wife doesn't have anything to wear today, and we got a lunch to go to.
Where are you going to lunch?
Just to friends. We're celebrating the Queen's Platinum Jubilee.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
There's a little bit of an expat community here in Las Vegas. Enough British or ex-British folks to throw together a party.
What comes after platinum?
Yeah, good question. Anniversary metals.
I don't think we're going to find out. But
I will never see a platinum anniversary of anything, I don't think. unless birthdays count, hopefully.
Yeah.
It's really extraordinary. 70 years of anything.
There's a 50-cent coin. I think that was the Silver Jubilee, and that was, Christ, probably mid-70s or something in Australia.
They probably had to invent these new jubilees. Like, she's easily the oldest reigning monarch ever.
Victoria was queen for a pretty long while, but not that long. Oh, Aaron just popped in and out. Yeah, I wonder who's next, Charles. I wonder how long he'll be around.
Most people don't think he'll take the reins, right? It'll go straight to
William.
Geez, I keep saying Harry, but it's who's the other one?
William.
He married the broad that isn't a psycho.
William,
yeah, it'll go straight to William.
You know, they say that in Australia, he's the only one who might salvage the fucking monarchy, because I don't know. I don't have an issue with Charles, but you know, a lot of people hate him.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say. And like the whole affair and divorce thing was a really big issue back then. Now it's been many decades now, so I think it's less of an issue. But
I've heard some British commentators complain that Charles gets too involved with political matters, which is a big no-no, right?
Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it doesn't matter too much. But yeah, I think Charles probably just needs to step aside. I mean, like the Queen only got her crown because the guy who had it wanted to go off with an American divorcee, right?
Yes.
So the fact that Charles is divorced is sort of, it sort of almost makes him ineligible by historical point. That being said, Diana's not alive anymore.
I'm just thinking, because there were some controversies with some of these princes, like with Harry with the swastika. Well, he's kind of excommunicated himself from the whole royal thing anyway, hasn't he? So, little fucker.
Aaron, I'm honestly terrible at any accent other than my own.
Yeah. Anyway,
But
man,
you know,
how does that-
I still think the monarchy is useful as best as at least as it is with the Queen. And honestly, like, you know, we are getting into the political here, but the Queen is literally the head of state of Australia,
Yep.
and she gets final word, quote unquote.
Are you bothered by the Whitlam sacking? I mean, you finish your thought, but this.
Yeah, well, I'm not ultimately the Whitlam sacking. I mean, Goff himself is very salty about it, but that's about it. I'm not sure that ultimately it really matters, because I mean the people got to vote for who they wanted to. We're talking about like basically a month, you know, a month or two where things were kind of in limbo, but people got to vote again. It's not like the Queen came down and said you must do X.
No,
but sometimes it's very hard to have in a constitutional republic a stop gap, a sort of stop on tyranny, basically. In America, the way that they have their stop and say like, this is, if things go bad, this is the way we'll rectify it, and that's the Second Amendment.
well, that's bullshit, though. You know that.
Well, we don't need to get into that too much, but let's just say it's difficult to maintain that last stop. Like once you have power going to here, and here, how do we prevent them from overstepping? Well, in Australia, you've got the Queen.
Is she
Like
really
if
a
the Prime Minister
stop,
went
though, or-
absolutely nutty and bat crazy insane, the Queen could literally step in and say, you know what, you're not Prime Minister anymore. And you know, and any power you had was really just by my own decree. So guess what? You don't get to do X.
I don't think she's a neutral arbiter like that. You know, ultimately, I view her as a Tory, and I don't think she has a problem with what you might call Western fascism. And so, you know, we would say, okay, it's a problem if the Australian government started doing something crazy to its own people.
Yes.
But outside of that, I don't know that, because, you know, basically they're trying to preserve an empire, right?
Yeah.
You know, whether we call it that or not.
Yeah. So I was a little disappointed in the last year and maybe 2 years where we started seeing some pretty extreme stuff happening in both Australia and Canada. And I always felt through this, there was the option that the Queen should have stepped in.
In Australia?
Yes. Yeah.
In what particular controversy are you referring to?
All of the lockdowns and stuff like that. But I guess the most acute example was the invocation of the Emergency Powers Act in Canada to handle a few truckers who are beeping their horn, who willingly stopped beeping their horns. Actually, there was a court order saying you can't beep your horn. They said, okay, we're not going to beep our horn anymore, and they still decided to invoke the Emergency Powers Act and try and freeze people's stuff. Like, I mean, at that level, the only person who could step in would have been the Queen. And I think if it went any longer than it did, she probably should have.
Well, you're right. I'm involved in a very complicated court case, and it's descended into basically 200 years of legislation and common law going back to the 1600s. And so I ended up basically writing a thesis on prerogative writs. This is a process where you go to, it used to be you would petition the Queen, basically, or the King, and you would seek relief, and they would, you know, overturn a bad decision against you by the state. It was always something to undo actions of the state. And
we don't have that in America as an example. Like,
right.
And Supreme Court grants the government its power and says that what the government did was good. That's it.
Common law is the closest thing Australia has to a proper like Bill of Rights or Constitution, and that's why it's outrageous that they don't teach us about it in school. But so in the early Australian history, you had New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land as its dependency, and there were no other colonies. And so the Australian Courts Act 1828, which is what I have depended on in my case, that actually transfers English common law and chancery law into Australian court systems by statute. And so you can actually refer to that. And this has been happening more and more in Tasmanian cases recently, because the state's getting out of control. And you can say this common law right has existed since, the 1600s. The Australian Courts Act confirms that it's within the powers of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court judge kind of has the powers you're talking about the Queen having, where they can point to someone in government or a lower court or whatever and say, you did something you couldn't lawfully do, and we're going to undo it. So we kind of have a backstop like that, but not many people know about it, and it's potentially expensive to go that route.
Interesting. Yeah, and yeah, you found the term that I was missing, backstop, not stopgap. Yeah, the backstop. Yeah, trying to influence a backstop without, like, I think the monarchs are clearly not an ideal backstop, but it's actually not bad.
Yeah, it's an extra check in a sense, and I wouldn't like to go to a US style replacement. That's for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it depends what you think the backstop is in America. I think ultimately, like, while they've got, I think they have. What's your opinion? I think that in general they have slightly better structure for keeping different branches of government in line, but their backstop is relatively weak and extreme at the same time with the Second Amendment, while appealing to the Queen is a reasonable thing to actually do.
Yes, the Second Amendment is not a backstop. The people who adhere to that typically are quite authoritarian, and you'll find that they'll actually form militias to support the government when there's like a tyrannical regime. And we saw this to an extent with what happened. I was just about to add you, Aaron, with Trump and January 6th, whether I'm not going to comment on whether Trump's a tyrant or not, but those militias were seeking to intimidate people on the street with their Second Amendment derived weapons. And I think in a more extreme situation where there is a civil war with actual gunfights, you would have the Second Amendment buffs actually supporting the government. That's just my theory. So I don't think it's a good start.
I think definitionally you're right, but both sides would be using the Second Amendment, right? Both sides of that civil war would hopefully have firearms.
I guess it's a matter of adopting, that option. So maybe that's a valid point, but I just feel like in all practicality, one side's going to dominate. It's kind of like in Australia, there's a very significant political partition on who owns firearms and who doesn't. And it's not meant to be political, but it's just worked out that way via the legislative framework. It's largely rural farmers, law enforcement, and I'm all for socialists owning firearms, but they tend not to. So if there were some kind of conflict, and it would there's never going to be encouragement for equal arm rights. I mean, these. Do you think Republicans want, or the Democrats, to go and take up firearms as a hobby the same way they do? Probably not. Right?
No. So like, there's like you probably don't know, but I'm really deep into the 2A and firearm stuff.
Yep.
And the NRA and Republicans do not represent much beyond the center-right group and overall thinking. The NRA is extremely aligned with, how would you say, establishment Republicans. And so the
Okay.
NRA advocates for gun laws. So, for example, they advocated for the bump stock ban. They advocated for, and still do advocate for, red flag laws, which are, in my opinion, extreme violations of constitutional rights. As in, the bump stock ban was literally a ban on firearms, and it was not passed by legislation. It was just simply presidential decree. He said these are now banned.
Right.
And so I have to pay money to actual gun lobbyists to fight that, not the NRA. The NRA was in favor of it.
But most people, if you break it down, I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, but most 2A buffs would support, for example, prohibitions on RPGs, right?
It depends. I think most, like the 2A side of the fence has steered more and more away from the NRA and more to an extreme form of the Second Amendment, where we would say, yes, you can own RPGs.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that there is a growing number of people who simply want completely unfettered access to all types of small arms.
That's interesting.
Like that's actually growing significantly. Like,
because back in the day, what year did they institute the Second Amendment? Must have been pretty early.
Probably 10 years after Constitution, right? I think that the Bill of Rights was about 10 years
back in those
after.
days. I assume the intention would have been to give groups of people like cannons and, you know, the typical warfighting weaponry of the day, rather than like restricting them to light weapons, which is basically what it is now.
I think the writing of the Second Amendment gives us a hint as to exactly what they mean, because they were talking about the people's guns, not sort of, you know, how do you say, what do you, like, the type of weapons that require a crew.
Well, don't they use the term well-regulated militia?
Yes, and I think that makes a lot of sense from the context. So they're saying a well-regulated militia necessary for the freedom. Let me just pull it up. Second Amendment. So it gives you context as to why they were protecting the right. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So the right of the people is a pre-existing right that shall not be infringed. And they give the context very, very literally, and that is that a well-regulated militia being necessary. I think what they're saying is explicitly no laws on firearms, especially the ones that people would like to own for themselves. And the context is so they can use them against politicians.
Yeah, no, I understand that. But in today's America, like, do you think, say you had a communist party that started gaining a little bit of traction, and I believe for some time that kind of revolution is more likely in America than most other countries, contrary to, you know, the whole idea of America. And do you think that the Second Amendment buffs, if I can use that term, would actually say they did have, you know, more or less unfettered access? They wouldn't go after whoever's in government, but they would actually start taking out communists and saying we're preventing tyranny because of the perception of communism. And so, you know, it could be a recipe for basically murder.
But I think that's what the founding fathers advocated for. And you could see it not just in the writing of the Second Amendment.
But does the Constitution elsewhere say that the US is a country of law?
I'm not. I think a lot of the quotes worth looking up are like that of Thomas Jefferson, that even by the time of his presidency, he worried about the dead ruling over the living.
Right.
You know, where there was no sunset clause on any of the laws they institute. These things are settled and moved on forever. That I think he had great suspicion of even the Bill of Rights and Constitution that he helped write.
Okay.
So I don't think that even Jefferson expected the United States to survive for very long. And maybe not because it would fail, but because he would not want it to survive for very long. As in,
right,
the statement of around, you know, the dead ruling over the living is like absolutely true. Like we have many laws that, like the main firearm law that prevents the purchase of machine guns here in America is the National Firearms Act. It was like enacted in 1934.
Do you think that taking out Lincoln was basically the manifestation of the Second Amendment achieving what it was designed for?
That's a good question. I don't think taking out Lincoln had any important effect. He achieved more than any other president, arguably. I mean,
Because
George Washington obviously was, you know, important.
Some would say he was imposing tyranny over the southern states.
And I think he was. So, but what I'm saying there is that the actual act of assassinating him probably didn't achieve much. But the fact that ordinary people had guns probably normally tempers most politicians' tyrannical leanings, right? Like you piss off enough people and don't be too surprised if one of them gets angry enough to try take pop shots at you.
That makes sense.
But clearly Lincoln did what he did in the face of that kind of scrutiny.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I don't I don't advocate for the killing Lincoln or justify it or anything like that. I don't think ultimately whatever he what Booth thought was important, it was completely inconsequential, right? As best as I can tell.
Yeah, and this is when, you know, the idea of courts kind of comes into it as a alternative dispute resolution. But I guess, you know, there is a point where the courts become corrupted and, you know, ignored potentially. If you have
I mean, a lot of Democrats think that right now of the Supreme Court, right?
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court is very strange because it's openly accepted as being political, right? Normally, it would be abhorrent to talk about having what do they call them, liberal justices and conservative justices. Right.
Yeah. The idea is that both were supposed to agree on people appointed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the court is politicized. However, from I'll just use the term conservatives' perspective, the conservative justices are just upholding the Constitution, while the liberal justices are sort of, I think they themselves openly advocate for like the use of the Supreme Court for political means. Like to me, that's my perspective, is that the left side of the Supreme Court is really not about, these are about protecting our rights. These are about protecting our newly created rights that aren't even created in legislation yet.
You're saying that the leftist judges are acting as legislators.
Yes.
When they shouldn't.
Yeah. I don't think they're willing to look at arguments around, but like, I basically, I don't believe any of them will uphold a decision that is unfair purely on the basis of law.
And have you ever been to court?
No, thankfully. I will do soon. I'm a witness to an attempted murder, so I've been subpoenaed a few times.
Well, you better not say too much about that.
It's all on
But-
video, so I'm sure
Okay.
it's going to be pretty simple statements.
Fuck, what was I going to say? Something about court. I've gone mind blank.
I just finished a statement saying I don't believe the left judges will uphold a ruling that is unfair, but is actually legal based on its legal merits. Like they're more concerned about fairness than actual legality.
Yeah, I mean, I know, and this is where it comes down to Australian law, English law versus American law. And, you know, it's been said that a court dealing an injustice is inherently an error of law. And this is where common law can come into play. But then you have, you know, is injustice a subjective thing or not? So yeah, it's like in my case, you know, it turned out the fucking chief magistrate was taken in evidence outside of the courtroom. So, you know, that's something I had to try and bring in later on with a lot of difficulty. So yeah, I don't know, man. It's complicated.
Yeah, over time, I've been even though quote unquote on the right side of the fence, we should be pretty happy with what the Supreme Court is right now. Overall, I'm not too sure that we have the right stopgaps in America, because you go from Supreme Court to firearms, basically. Like that's where the stopgaps are, and the problem with Supreme Court is that ultimately it's a government entity that seems as political as the legislature, and they get to decree what the government does is constitutional or not. Like they're the final arbiter, and it's popularized as that. But if they're not the final arbiter, then we're talking about guns on the streets.
What if you just had like some clause where you would trigger a referendum on any crisis? That works.
Yeah, the problem with that is like usually the things the Supreme Court are dealing with that are of interest to me anyway deal with whether or not the country is a republic or not. So referendums are strictly democratic ways of deciding things that maybe shouldn't be democratic.
So you're one of these people who says the US is not a democracy, it's a republic.
Yes, yeah. But
why
I mean,
can't it be a
think
democratic republic?
we're
Like
clearly getting into like semantics. So for me,
not, well, I don't think it is, because they're not mutually exclusive.
For certain things, it has to be mutually exclusive. So, for example, can someone own their gun? Can someone speak their mind even when everyone else thinks they're wrong and should shut up? You know what I mean? Like in a democratic process that doesn't uphold any idea of it being a republic, is that whatever the group decides is what they get, and all the minorities have to be physically compelled to comply.
I get where you go. I think that's a deep area to explore. I might have to leave it to another night because I got to get going.
No worries. But I mean, I think like America, there's a lot of fetishization of democracy and democratic process for anything. But I like to draw a corollary to that, in that in general, democracy is kind of the worst way to handle anything.
It's a bit of a golden calf.
Well, I would go down to when you decide with your friends and family which restaurant to go to dinner to. Do you decide that democratically? If someone says, I will not go, usually even the individual in such a situation does actually have veto power, basically. Like they go, well, there's no vegetarian options there. I'm a vegetarian. You wouldn't all go, well, tough luck, mate. There's 11 of us and one of you. You guys will actually find a different restaurant to satisfy that one person, typically.
Yep.
So even in just deciding dinner, we think democracy would be an abhorrent way to solve that situation. You don't want to alienate your friend for just for the purpose of like, you know what, everyone else wanted it, so let's go.
I wouldn't dispute that democracy does result in all kinds of unfortunate management decisions for countries. I got to get going, man. I got to do a couple of things before I go to bed. I'll wind it up, guys. Thanks to everyone in the chat who came in and left comments. And see you guys in the next stream.
Lovely trying to you, Cuddy.
You too, mate. See you later.